Hi, my name is Linfeng Xiang from the University of Texas at Arlington. Today I'm going to show you with some interesting findings we had profiling the Intel Optane persistent memory. This is a joint work with my colleague Xingsheng Zhao and Professor Jia Rao, Song Jiang, and Hong Jiang. Non-volatile memory or persistent memory has attracted much attention due to its potential to build large memory systems with a relatively low cost. The support for persistence allows applications to retain its data upon a power failure or system crash. The Intel DC persistent memory is the first commercially available NVMe that can be directly accessed by CPU via load or store instructions. It features a 3 times cheaper price per gigabyte than DRAM, but is also considerably slower. Internally, the physical 3D X-point media in Optane DC memory has an access granularity of 256 bytes, which is referred as an XP line, as the cache line access granularity is 64 bytes and smaller. Optane DC memory is equipped with undimmed buffering to perform read-modify-write operations in order to bridge the gap in access granularities. To ensure persistence, the memory controller sits within the asynchronous DRAM refresh domain, and any stores reaching the ADR domain, such as the write pending queue in the IMC or read-modify-write buffer, will be persisted upon a crash. The second generation Optane DC memory includes CPU caches in the ADR domain, but requires more battery reserve and a more sophisticated power system to ensure persistence. The major obstacle to adopting persistent memory in programming is the need to ensure crash consistency in an event of power failure. Programmers need to ensure that writes reach the ADR domain by flushing them from the CPU caches via cache line flashback instructions or simply bypassing the cache using non-temporal stores. The order of cache line flushes should also follow the program order, and this is usually done via memory barriers. Finally, as today's processors only guarantee atomicity for 8-byte stores, any writes that modify data larger than 8 bytes needs to use undo or redo logging or shadow paging to ensure update atomicity. While there are stark differences between DCP-MEM and traditional DRAM in access granularity, the memory communication protocol and their internal designs, DCP-MEM is directly plugged in the memory bus and share much of the programming interface, CPU caching and coherence, and memory consistency model. In this paper, we are interested in studying how the new memory technology interacts with the traditional memory hierarchy and the performance implications. Since its arrival, there has been interest in characterizing the performance of DCP-MEM, which motivated this work. Several independent work confirmed the existence of a 16 kilobyte read-modify-write buffer for merging small writes and reducing write amplification, as well as the asymmetry in read-write performance. Notably, compared to DRAM, DCP-MEM performance depends strongly on access sequentiality. However, many remain unknown and deserve investigation. In particular, undimmed buffering adds another layer of caching on the memory hierarchy. It is unclear if the gap in the cache line and media access granularities opens up opportunities for potential data reuse in undimmed buffers and how the undimmed buffering interacts with the rest of the memory hierarchy. It is also interesting to study the performance implications of cache line flush and memory fences. In this work, we design micro-benchmarks with specially designed access patterns to infer the internal design of undimmed buffers. We use write and read amplifications to infer undimmed buffering activities. We had 2 test beds with G1 and G2 Optane memory. Persistent memory is mounted to program virtual address space using the DEX mode in ext4. First, we analyze the capacity of the read buffer and its management. The benchmark program accesses a contiguous persistent memory region in a stride of 256 bytes. The first cache line access to an XP line will load the entire XP line from the media. The following accesses to cache lines in an XP line will not result in new media loads if they hit the read buffer. The working set size of the number of cache lines accessed per XP line are configurable. We monitor read amplification to infer where the cache line accesses hit the read buffer to know its design. The figure shows read amplification with different working set sizes. One notable observation is that when the benchmark repetitively accesses the same cache line in each XP line, read amplification remains full, even with small working set sizes. The results suggest that the benchmark never hits the cache line loaded by the IMC and already in the CPU cache. The undimmed read buffer and the CPU caches are exclusive. In contrast, accessing multiple cache lines per XP line leads to lower read amplification, matching the ratio of accessed and unaccessed cache lines. It suggests that the cache lines not loaded by the IMC are temporarily cached on the DIMM. When the working set size exceeds the read buffer size, read amplification jumps to 4, indicating buffer misses. We also confirmed that the read buffer size is 16 kilobytes in G1 Optane, and the G2 Optane has a slightly larger read buffer. To infer the design of write buffering, we perform the partial and full writes to XP line-sized elements in random or sequential order. The writes are non-temporal stores that do not involve CPU caching. We repetitively write to the same XP line with varying working set sizes and use the write amplification to infer buffer sizes and misses so as to estimate the buffer size and the write-back policy. The results show that there exist two write-back mechanisms in G1 Optane. Full writes are periodically written back to media, while partial writes are retained in the buffer until evicted. Note that the estimated write buffer size, 12 kilobytes, is slightly smaller than reported by previous studies. However, G2 Optane disables periodic write-back. Previous profiling studies have revealed that one can directly read and update 30 XP lines in the read-modify-write buffer. Next, we study whether a single read-modify-write buffer serves to buffer reads and writes. We allocated two non-overlapping persistent memory regions for read and write. The benchmark jumps between the two regions and performs interleaved reads and writes. We use cache line flushes and non-temporal stores to ensure no reads or writes are cached in the CPU cache. The size of the read and write regions fits in the estimated read and write buffer size, but the aggregated size, for instance 16 kilobytes plus 8 kilobytes, overflows either buffer. We compare the write and read amplifications of the benchmark with two baseline programs that only access the read or write region respectively. If the benchmark with interleaved read and write behave differently from the baseline programs, it indicates read and write interfere with each other and the buffers are a shared space. Otherwise, the read and write buffers are separate. Our results show that the benchmark have the same RA and WA as the baseline programs do, suggesting separate read and write buffers. Our results also show that writes to recently read XP lines or read from a dirty XP lines do not incur any media activities. However, updated XP lines in the read buffer are subject to write-back, since the read and write buffers are separate. An XP line tagging mechanism is likely in place to move XP lines between the two buffers. In this test, we study if there are any prefetching activities into the undimmed buffers and their interactions with CPU prefetching. The benchmark accesses randomly ordered whose nodes are XP line-sized data blocks. It sequentially accesses every cache line multiple times within an XP line to trigger prefetching. We use the read ratio, which is defined as the ratio of actually loaded data over the program demanded data, to measure the amount of prefetched data. A read ratio above 1 indicates prefetching, but it could be due to CPU prefetching or undimmed prefetching or both. The figures here show the read ratio in both G1 and G2 Optane for both the IMC and DCP MEM when all CPU hardware prefetchers are enabled, and they are similar. To isolate CPU prefetching and undimmed prefetching, we compare the read ratio when all CPU prefetchers are disabled and enabled individually. We found that most data prefetched to undimmed buffers are due to CPU prefetching. Most importantly, the read ratio for DCP MEM is much higher than that of the IMC, since data blocks are randomly ordered. Prefetching at the boundary of 256 bytes constitutes a misprefetching cost. The fundamental reason for the high misprefetching penalty is due to the mismatch between cache line access granularity, which is the unit for prefetching, and the media access granularity. A seemingly sequential access pattern within an XP line does not necessarily lead to sequential access across XP lines. This calls for changes in the CPU prefetcher to consider XP lines to reduce misprefetching cost. After demonstrating the interplay between CPU prefetching and undimmed buffering, we move on to studying the interaction between CPU caching and undimmed buffering. The benchmark traverses a sequentially or random linked list, in which each element is of XP line size. The pointer of an element is in the first cache line, and a write occurs in a separate cache line. This access pattern resembles those in hash tables and various tree structures. This benchmark is a write-dominant workload, though the pointer chasing is a read to an element. To decouple the latency due to the pointer chasing and following write, we devise two variants of the benchmark. One only performs pointer chasing, while the other stores the pointer addresses of the elements in a DRAM array. In the latter, access to each element begins with a read from DRAM followed by a write to DCP mem. The two figures show the per element latency in the original benchmark and the latency breakdown of read and write. A notable observation in the right figure is that hitting the write buffer leads to low but ramping latency as the working set size increases. However, after working set size goes beyond the write buffer capacity, write latency is consistent regardless of the working set size. In contrast, read enjoys CPU cache latency as long as the working set size fits in the last level cache, but increases dramatically afterwards. While the common belief is that write is more expensive than read, the asynchronous DDRT protocol, together with write buffering, help hide write latency. In contrast, due to its small size, read buffering does not help much in exploiting read locality or hide read latency. Random read could dominate performance in workloads with a large working set size. However, asynchronous write does not come with no cost. Next, we study if asynchronous writes could affect future reads. The benchmark has a reader chasing a writer that performs persists. The write issues a memory fence before invoking the reader. We control the distance between the reader and writer to manage the recency of addresses the reader reads. If the distance is short, a reader may read an address at which a writer is still pending. This figure shows the reader's latency with various settings. First, reading a recently persisted cache line suffers high latency. The read latency gradually converges to undimmed read buffer latency as the distance increases. The figures also plots the read latency of the same benchmark on DRAM. The RAP issue is not as severe as that in DCP mem. The culprit is that memory fences return whenever the persists such as cache line flushes and long-term restores become globally visible in the cache coherence protocol. It does not guarantee the completion of the persist to the media. When reading an address that is yet to be written to the media, latency skyrockets. This discovery calls for studies on how to leverage asynchronous write in DCP mem but to avoid long RAP latency. While we have many insights in profiling DCP mem, the most important takeaways from our papers are: first, the read and write buffers are separate and serve distinct purposes. We advocate decoupling of read and write in performance analysis and optimizations in DCP mem. Second, the mismatch between the cache line access granularity and media access granularity presents a difficult trade-off. While it's beneficial to pack data structures in XP line-sized aligned blocks, doing so may increase the misprefetching penalty or cause long RAP latency. Based on the aforementioned insights, we present 3 case studies in the paper. Please read our paper for details. The CCEH case study demonstrates that random reads are a major performance bottleneck in a large hash table. The fast and fair B+ tree study shows the severity of read after persist latency. The case study with XP line aligned workloads shows how avoiding misprefetching could result in improved performance. In this paper, we have presented a suite of carefully designed micro benchmarks that help us infer the design of undimmed buffers and discover 3 interesting issues. Based on the insights, we present 3 case studies demonstrating substantial performance improvements. Please refer to our paper for more discussion on the changes between G1 and G2 Optane and the new EADR feature. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.